You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome back to another episode of People, Places, Planet, and thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Dara Albrecht, and today we're going to wade through the world of wetlands restoration. Many folks don't realize this, but wetlands are an essential line of defense against climate impacts and can be found in diverse geographies around the U.S. We're going to discuss their importance, talk about climate resilience, and discuss compensatory mitigation. Today, I'm welcoming three experts that will dive into this topic with me. Dave Groves, Meghan Halabisky, and Karen Johnson. I'm glad to have you all here.
Thanks, Dara. It's great to be here.
Before we jump into questions, I want to set the scene a little bit for our listeners. Like I said, wetlands can be found all across the U.S. and are an important line of defense against climate impacts. These critical habitats sequester significant amounts of carbon and provide essential functions that can lessen the impacts of climate change and make communities more resilient. So, protecting and restoring wetlands is essential for building this climate resilience. But in order to make wetland restoration sites sustainable over the long term, climate change must be considered in siting and design. To ensure long-term sustainability, new climate realities must be considered in the preservation and restoration of wetlands, streams, and other aquatic resources. Under the Clean Water Act, billions of dollars are invested in the restoration and protection of wetlands and other aquatic resources to offset permitted impacts to these habitats, including those projects undertaken as part of the compensatory mitigation process. ELI has been researching how climate change is incorporated into compensatory mitigation. Today, we'll hear from a scientist, Dr. Meghan Halabisky, about how climate change is currently impacting wetlands, and from two mitigation practitioners, Dave Groves and Karen Johnson, about how they're adapting their management and planning practices. So with that, why don't y'all go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Karen Johnson. I'm the Director of Wetland and Stream Mitigation for the Nature Conservancy in Virginia. I've been with our program for 20 years now, the Virginia Aquatic Resources Trust Fund. We're an in-lieu fee program providing offsets for impacts to wetlands, streams, non-tidal and tidal wetlands throughout the state of Virginia. And I came to Virginia and the Conservancy from South Carolina, where I started working with a local land trust on protecting land throughout South Carolina.
Hi, Dara. Dave Groves with the Earth Partners. We're a land restoration firm, and we own and operate a portfolio of mitigation banks on the Texas coast, and we're developing some on the eastern seaboard. I came to the Earth Partners. I've been with the firm for the last 7 years, but before that, I was a senior policy advisor in the Council on Environmental Quality in President Obama's White House, advising on policies that allow for the enabling conditions of environmental markets, including mitigation banking.
My name is Meghan Halabisky. I'm a remote sensing ecologist. I typically think about wetlands at a broad landscape level scale. I don't get out into the field too much, but I started my career as a conservation manager, so most of my research really focuses on developing practical tools for managers that address freshwater ecosystems like wetlands. My background includes work with a program called Digital Earth Africa. I'm a research scientist at the University of Washington and now co-founder of a new initiative called Teal Waters.
It's nice to meet you all, and thanks for sharing about your expertise too. It's great to hear about the specific experiences that led you to work in this sphere and get a sense for your areas of interest. So, I mentioned a little bit about the importance of wetlands, but I want to hear from y'all. What are some ways that we can restore wetlands, and what does wetlands restoration actually entail?
Yeah, I think that folks who are on the ground have more practical ideas of what that looks like. I can speak very broadly to the folks that I've worked with and what I see. And, there's a lot of really cool examples of how folks are doing restoration. It could mean, for example, identifying areas where there's channel incisement and where a stream or a river used to flood a wetland, and that would mitigate flooding. That would create habitat, but is no longer doing so because now the channel is so incised that the water can't flood over the banks of that stream. So one of the things that folks are looking at is identifying those areas where there's channel unsizement and there could be potential reconnection to the floodplain, either through putting in large woody debris or bringing back beavers or some sort of beaver mimicry. And now that area that didn't flood can now flood.
Yeah, and I'll just add in, there's three well-known characteristics of wetlands: the soils, the hydrology, and the vegetation. And in most of the restoration sites that we're pursuing in Virginia, we're looking to address the hydrology and the vegetation. So taking a site that has underlying wetland soils, hydric soils, but they might be a situation where the area has been ditched and drained and utilized over a number of years. And now we're looking at the site to restore that hydrology. Along with that, we're going to restore wetland vegetation. And then after a number of years, that restoration site will meet and have all three characteristics of a functioning wetland: the soils, hydrology, and vegetation.
Wetland and stream restoration can look very different based on where you are, what your geography is, the region that you're in. For example, if you're in Pennsylvania, there's an enormous amount of legacy sediment that's been deposited as the result of old mills and run-of-the-river dams. And you end up getting stream incisement there. The stream incisement cuts down through the legacy sediment. It disconnects the stream from the floodplain, and therefore the water flushes out through the system. There's no settling of sediments, there's no natural deposition, and there's basically a disconnection from any kind of natural hydrology that would have occurred or any of the habitat opportunities. So in a place like Pennsylvania, or really up and down the East Coast, we'll say, where all this legacy sediment occurs, then one typical restoration intervention is to basically recut the stream channel to create its natural sinuosity, meaning the meander of what that stream used to be once upon a time before, kind of European descendants showed up and messed up the ecosystem and the watershed. And then that reconnects the stream to the floodplain of the stream. And, it has all kinds of benefits from hydrologic, chemical, biological values. If you're doing wetland restoration work, say on the Gulf Coast, that's going to look very different. It might be you're getting rid of an old rice paddy. You're getting rid of all of the non-native species that were planted there or have since kind of come into that ecosystem. You're reconnecting that field to, it might be an adjacent bayou, and you're reestablishing the natural hydrology that existed between that field, which was once a floodplain, but then became a rice paddy. Another common intervention might be where there's a field directly next to a river. And what happened was maybe 150 years ago, a farmer arrived and built a berm, separating the field from the river to allow cattle to graze or to plant a crop. And what the intervention would be to break that berm, reestablish the hydrology from the river to that field, removing all of the non-native species, planting native species. And now all of a sudden you have a river floodplain instead of a separated river with an adjacent field and a berm in between.
Thanks for going into depth a little bit more about ways that we can restore wetlands and what wetlands restoration actually is. So now we'll turn to Meghan. Meghan, can you tell us more about your work as a scientist and how you're seeing climate change affect wetlands restoration today?
Sure. So, Dara, my research focuses mostly on building practical methods and tools that help us better map where wetlands are, where they used to be, and what wetlands do, like storing carbon, reducing flooding, and supporting biodiversity. And in developing these tools, I work closely with a diverse group of practitioners. And what I see is that one of the biggest challenges that we face in starting to think about this is that we're starting at a deficit. We've already lost a lot of wetlands. We've lost over 50% of the wetlands in the US, and in some watersheds, it's much higher. So what that means is that we no longer have the natural buffers that we once did, and wetlands that could store water during floods and slowly release it during droughts, they are now gone. And so we're kind of starting at a place that makes it already challenging. But on top of that, now we have climate change change, and that's really reshaping the functions that wetlands provide. So like places in the Pacific Northwest where we're expecting warmer, wetter winters with earlier snowmelt, hotter, drier summers, all of that is going to alter the timing and the quantity of water entering wetland systems. So this is a challenge for managers, and being able to understand how that will impact wetlands into the future. But I think that there's also kind of an opportunity here in that wetlands also can really help us respond to climate change. So if we plan restoration with climate change in mind, wetlands now become a solution, helping to mitigate floods, sequester carbon, cool the landscape, and build more resilience. So I think there's a lot of change to manage, but it's also an enormous amount of opportunity to build more resilience back into communities that are now struggling with these climate extremes and climate changes.
And I think that's a key point, right? Just how important wetlands are. Because I think when the average person hears wetlands, they think swamp, they think marsh. Don't step in there, there's nothing of value there, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So hearing about the potential benefits of wetlands and the drastic impacts climate change could have on them makes us realize just how essential they are to our societies and to our way of life. With this in mind, how can we attribute what's happening, these impacts on wetlands, to climate change?
So that's a really complex question, but one that's really interesting to me. I think with other ecosystems, they're a little easier to monitor because they're less dynamic. So with wetlands, the challenge is they're so dynamic that it's difficult to understand what is normal wetland dynamics, flooding and drying. They maybe thrive for several years, but that might be part of their normal cycle. And trying to understand what is abnormal and what is kind of flipping it into a different type of hydrologic system. I think that is one of the big challenges with wetlands. We see a lot of change happening using remote sensing to map and monitor changes to wetlands across the landscape. We can see that there's a lot of impacts that are not climate driven. They're just disturbance, development, changes in hydrology based on land use changes. But trying to pull that apart from normal dynamics and from potential climate changes is really tricky to do. We have a lot more tools available to us now. One of the tools I rely on is satellite remote sensing, which allows us to reach back in time and reconstruct the patterns and processes of wetlands to try and understand how they've responded to climate in the past and develop models to understand how they might respond to climate in the future. Using those tools like satellite remote sensing, we can start to pull apart these different impacts to wetlands, but it is really tricky because of their kind of complex dynamics.
Right. And understanding the tools is so important. When we restore a site, we want it to stay restored, right? So how can science inform site design to incorporate climate considerations and ensure that these restored sites are sustainable over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to remind you, my personal experience is really thinking about things at a very broad scale. So using remote sensing and modeling hydrologic flows to understand where might be areas that if flow was restored could build back functions that are missing within the watershed. So I think we're at a place now where the science is getting better. To be honest, again, wetlands are lagged behind a lot of other ecosystems in developing the best science to help understand what are they doing, what are the functions, even where they are. The maps are not very good. They're missing a lot of wetlands and they have bias in them. And so I think one of the things that we are now able to do is to use a lot of really high-tech tools and data like LiDAR, high-resolution remote sensing imagery to help us better understand where wetlands are now, but also where wetlands likely used to be. What was the intrinsic potential of areas that have characteristics that could support wetlands? So I think a lot of my research, again, it focuses on identifying areas that used to be wetlands and then trying to model or map the functions that could be brought back if that area was restored. So kind of helping us get a zoomed out picture of where we might have better success at wetland restoration and what kind of functions we could gain back if those areas were restored. And then also, again, you're always at the back of your mind thinking about, well, how is that going to change with climate change? But we can model those hydrologic inputs and how they may change, whether it's groundwater or surface water flows, and how understanding projections, those surface flows, groundwater levels may change, and how that may impact impact the hydrology, which then impacts the functions of the wetlands. So I think we have a lot more tools available. They're not easily accessible for most practitioners, and they're expensive to implement. But I think we're getting closer and closer to be able to understand a lot more information at a landscape scale that can inform better site selection and understand what activities would be most successful to restore functions that are really necessary for building better resilience under climate change. I do know that it's with a lot of the folks I work with, how do we plan for more uncertainty and those climate extremes, but also the shifts in climate? And that I think is a huge challenge that I'm not even going to try to attempt to speak to.
Yeah, well, thank you for explaining to us some of the broader scale considerations for making sure that sites that we invest in restoring can stay restored over time. So now let's transition over to practitioners on the ground. Karen and David, you're both practitioners in this field of compensatory mitigation and wetlands restoration. So to get started, could you each tell us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So our work with the Virginia Aquatic Resources Trust Fund, we're an in lieu fee mitigation provider. So what that means is that we are one option to offset permitted impacts to wetlands and streams. And in our case, our program is Virginia. It's a statewide program. So we're going to offset impacts that have been permitted either through the Corps of Engineers or through our Virginia Department of Environmental Quality as applicants, developers, homeowners, the community, cities, towns, whomever, as they have projects, development projects, maintenance projects that require an impact to a stream or a wetland, they have to go through the mitigation hierarchy, which means that they should first avoid those waters of the U.S., then they should minimize the impacts. And if they have avoided and minimized this to the maximum extent, but there are still some wetlands or streams that need to be impacted through their project, then they have to compensate. So our program serves as one option to compensate for those impacts. So as an in lieu fee program, these are programs that can be sponsored and run by nonprofits or by government agencies. The Nature Conservancy is a global nonprofit, and we've been engaging through this in lieu fee program and with mitigation for 30 years now. Our program was established in 1995, and we have been offsetting impacts to wetlands primarily since we began and streams since 2003. So in that offset, our program provides mitigation credits to applicants. We sell those credits to the applicants, and then we accumulate those funds and then identify suitable projects, suitable compensation or mitigation sites to offset those impacts. So we are essentially using mitigation dollars to find and restore ecologically important sites throughout Virginia. The Conservancy is responsible for implementing the projects, maintaining, monitoring the projects, and ensuring that they meet the success standards that have been defined for mitigation sites. And those standards are applicable to all mitigation sites, whether they're an in lieu fee program site, a mitigation bank site, or a permitting responsible site. Those standards are set by the regulatory agencies, so by the Corps of Engineers and our Department of Environmental Quality.
And Dave, you're a mitigation banker. As Karen mentioned, mitigation banks are another way that compensatory mitigation happens. But what actually is a mitigation bank? Is it a bank in the traditional sense?
A mitigation bank, the nomenclature is a little bit confusing. If people think of bank, they think financial institution, but a mitigation bank is actually, think of it as a large site that previously had degraded aquatic resources on it, being a wetland or a stream. And an entity comes in known as a mitigation bank sponsor, and they go through a process to basically restore or enhance the ecological value of the wetlands or streams on this site. And so they turn it from a degraded site into a high-functioning wetland and or stream project. By doing so, through that ecological uplift, they create these fungible credits that they can then sell to third parties who are impacting wetland or streams in the same watershed. So it's a very localized market. The regulators who create this program don't want all of the restoration happening in one watershed and all of the degradation happening in another watershed. They want it to sort of all stay localized. So therefore, these credits that are created at a mitigation bank can only be sold to development interests who are impacting aquatic resources within the same relatively small watershed, known as a hydrologic unit code, or HUC, to use our parlance. And these HUCs are only about the size of most counties, just to put perspective for your listeners.
In your day-to-day work, are you incorporating climate considerations in your site planning and management processes to ensure long-term sustainability and resilience? And if so, how are you doing this?
So, mitigation bank sponsors basically follow the policies and requirements as laid out by the regulatory agencies that govern the program. In most cases, that's going to be the federal agencies of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency. There are some states where the state agency takes a very active role in administering the program and setting out the requirements and policies. And then there's a lot of states where the state agencies kind of hold everything at arm's length. And to date, climate considerations have only kind of marginally made their way into the policy making process and the requirements that the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA hold, and the requirements that they put on mitigation bankers as they develop mitigation banks. For example, regarding site selection, mitigation bankers are oftentimes encouraged by the Army Corps to build their projects in priority watersheds. These priority watersheds, oftentimes, they become priorities because maybe they have a proximity to already protected areas, because these watersheds have a particular benefit to reducing flooding to downstream resources. They have particular benefits around water quality. So, all of these things make for a watershed that is more resilient to a changing climate. If there's a restored wetland or stream upstream of some important resources and the hydrologic regime of that watershed changes over time because of climate change, now all of a sudden that watershed is more resilient. But I wouldn't say that up to this point, the Army Corps or the EPA or many state agencies, at least that I'm aware of, are taking into account more explicitly the impacts of a changing climate in terms of site selection. As far as the design of the banks themselves, we as an organization aren't really taking into account the realities of a changing climate when it comes to the design. And that's, again, because of the incentives that are put on to us by the regulatory agencies. I'm not aware of any bankers who are doing that. So site selection does kind of almost tangentially, we take into account changing climate, but design, I would say less so.
With our program, the biggest consideration that we are using is in our site planning. So all NLUFI programs have to have, as part of their program instrument, something called a compensation planning framework. And within the Nature Conservancy, we designed ours to reflect the best available science that our scientists had accumulated and were continuing to evolve and utilize. So our compensation planning framework focuses as a tiered approach on resilient and connected networks. So we are using a GIS-driven site planning tool where we are evaluating terrestrial, coastal, and freshwater resilience, as well as connectedness. So with all of our sites, even before this data was available, site suitability, sites that are adjacent to other protected areas, large corridors, those have always been a target and a priority for us when we are doing site selection. Some things that may be changing when considering climate factors is trying to develop a site that fits in with a larger buffer. All of our mitigation standards and guidelines are driven by the state and federal regulators, but we can put on greater buffers, greater importance on that site selection. And we try to do that with each site that we are selecting, because they do need to be able to withstand in perpetuity for the long term. And the suitability of that and the connectedness of that to other protected, forested, existing, resilient wetland or freshwater features is going to be important, far beyond the 10-year monitoring period that we may have for our mitigation sites.
Thank you both for explaining climate considerations. David, how do you foresee climate change impacting the role of mitigation bankers in the future?
So, as I said before, mitigation bankers basically are incentivized to make their decisions based on the policies set forth by the federal agencies that oversee the program, the Army Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency. And currently, we're under an administration where the official policy of these agencies and of the entire U.S. federal government is that climate change doesn't exist. And so, therefore, we're not going to act on a problem that doesn't exist. So in the short term, there's going to be really no change at all to our program. I mean, there's going to be change in the sense that the administration has plans to significantly reduce the jurisdictional scope of the Clean Water Act. So the existential threat that the mitigation banking industry is seeing right now is not from a changing climate, but actually from policy choices that are being made that will significantly reduce the demand for the credits that we are generating. And if we're reducing demand for the very thing that we create, then there's going to be a reduction in the development of mitigation banking projects over the long term. So that's the bigger thing that we're concerned with. Over the long run, as we see a change in administrations and a federal government that recognizes reality and the science, then really it's going to be up to the federal agencies to incentivize mitigation bankers to incorporate climate change into their decisions around things like site selection, project design, the performance standards that we're living up to. Basically, we're going to respond to the incentives that are put forward by the regulatory agencies.
I think one of the things that we are having to consider is extreme weather events and drought conditions, storm events. Those are things that will impact our mitigation sites, both during the installation and the monitoring phase, as well as into the future. So as a mitigation provider, we have to account for that, we have to budget for that, and we have to be able to respond to that. So it can make implementing these projects a slightly greater risk or a greater risk, depending on where you're doing the work and the type of work that you're doing. So having to account for that, plan for that, and respond to that as needed are things that we have to address and take into account to meet the success that's governed by the regulatory agencies and ensure that when we finish the project, it can withstand changes in whatever form may come into the future.
So, Karen and David, what tools, resources, and best available science do you utilize when evaluating climate impact?
The tool that we use is the Resilient and Connected Network that's been designed by the Nature Conservancy. So this addresses freshwater, terrestrial, and coastal resilience, identifying areas that can respond to resilience, that are resilient, and that can benefit from restoration. It's focused on areas that have known biodiversity, as well as the different conservation status of those areas, and really establishing corridors and zones that species and populations can move as climate changes. So using that tool is something that we've incorporated into our site selection that we're hopeful will account for excellent sites as we move through climate change.
In an ideal world, the Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, and state agencies that oversee the mitigation banking program would require tools like what TNC uses to predict future habitat corridors and stresses from changing hydrologic regimes in different watersheds. It would be ideal to roll that out across the country and make it region specific. Right now, there's not really any tools that are required at a broad base in that way. For example, when stream engineers are designing their streams, there's a lot of work that goes into, there's a lot of modeling to make sure that the stream itself has the amount of sinuosity that's required based on what would be a 100-year storm event or a 500-year storm event in that particular watershed, and what the water budget is and the amount of acre feet of water flushing through the system to make sure that sinuosity matches the amount of water so it doesn't wash the stream out, for example, after it's been restored. And the data, as far as I'm aware, and the reference conditions used in this modeling are all basically based on past and historical data and not really forward-looking data. I could be wrong on this, but I believe that's the case. And so given that hydrologic regimes are changing all over the world and certainly all over the country, having more kind of predictive modeling would be ideal. I don't know if this is where we could bring, AI tools into the process and into the decision making. I think the challenge is that there's still a fair bit of uncertainty when it comes to these climate models. So it's a little hard to take a climate model and translate that into actual numbers, that an engineer would use to update their water budget for any given watershed. The same thing is true for predicting sea level rise. There's a lot of, mitigation banks that are right along the coast that were constructed under a certain salinity regime, for example. A salt marsh, maybe the lower end of the bank is more saline and more marine ecosystem. And as you move kind of uphill, it becomes more brackish and then fresh. And eventually those banks, based on predicted sea level rise, will all be saline, and probably the lower portions of those banks will be fully marine. But again, the unpredictability of climate modeling makes it hard to kind of design or translate requirements into how you're going to design a bank based on, an unknown future.
Thank you so much for expanding on those considerations. I think it's really interesting to hear about what you utilize in practice. Meghan, from your perspective as a scientist, how do you communicate complex climate impact data to stakeholders? And how can you effectively share this data with communities, practitioners like Karen and David, and decision makers?
Dara, one of the big challenges with wetlands is that they are vastly understudied compared to other ecosystems. There just simply aren't a lot of scientists who study climate change impacts on wetlands. This is especially true for inland wetlands. They also just don't get the attention in the news and the headlines at conferences that other ecosystems do. And so I see even in the wetland and natural resource community, there's a lot of misconceptions. For example, in working with a large group of stakeholders in Eastern Washington, what most folks kind of came in thinking was that most of the wetlands in Eastern Washington, it's a very dry ecosystem, are just going to get drier under a changing climate. And so why do any sort of restoration in these areas? But I think what often gets missed is that wetlands have very complex hydrologic inputs and drivers. So really understanding the hydrology of wetlands is extremely important when considering how they're going to change under climate change. And I think this message somehow gets simplified or lost. So for example, in Eastern Washington, what we see is that some wetlands that are driven by surface water flows and storing water in really shallow basins may in fact get drier under climate change projections where we see hotter and drier summers. But in Washington, we also are expecting to see wetter winters and more flood events. And so wetlands that can store groundwater can mitigate some of those impacts of a hotter, drier summer. And so when we kind of model this across an area like as vast as Eastern Washington, we can see that in fact it's nonlinear, that changes to the hydrology of wetlands is not going to just shift in one direction. In fact, it could shift in two directions. Some wetlands could get much wetter. That can cause a whole suite of problems or opportunities. And some wetlands can get much drier. And again, you can have a whole suite of problems and opportunities. In some cases, we can model all of this. In Eastern Washington, I was able to model these impacts and present it to the community, and we can have a dialogue about what that looks like. And so those conversations are really important. But we can't do that everywhere. For that project in particular, I use satellite remote sensing to map the historic changes in water availability. But in a lot of areas, for a lot of wetlands, you just can't see the surface water changes using remote sensing. They're hidden under canopy, or they're just saturated soils. But we can still model those hydrologic inputs, those drivers, whether that's surface water, groundwater, overbank flooding, and understanding what those hydrologic inputs are for each wetland and how they may change, whether it's going to increase or decrease, or the timing seasonally will shift, is a really important starting point in thinking about how a particular site may evolve over time or change under a changing climate. I think that message doesn't come out very clearly within the scientific community. It's one that needs to be strengthened, because I think we can think about the theoretical components of hydrology and wetlands and really understand how that may change. But I also think that we don't have a lot of tools. And there are some tools available, but really a lot of the science is still in papers and little bits of code here and there, but isn't really accessible as a software, as a tool that practitioners can easily use. One of the big things that I'm focusing on now is, with funding from the National Science Foundation, is to start this initiative called Teal Waters. Teal Waters is sort of the areas that are in between that often get missed in a lot of water resource planning. The combination of those green vegetated areas and those blue aquatic areas, that kind of teal space. So this partnership with the University of Washington and a spatial mapping company called TerrainWorks, we're trying to develop a suite of tools that can be open source, that can be developed and be applied more broadly for more practitioners. But I have to say right now, it feels really limiting of what's available. And even the conversation amongst scientists and practitioners feels separated. And sometimes we come together and we're able to have these really rich conversations. But I think specifically with the wetland community, we're a bit more challenged. We don't have like one agency that can bring all of these different people together to have these conversations. So this is a good start with a podcast, but I think, again, there's not a lot of opportunity to really dig into the details about how wetlands will respond to climate change and how important they are in thinking about how we can make communities more resilient to these impacts that we're seeing. For example, I see headlines of all these huge impacts happening, weather events that are impacting communities and flooding areas. And I think, gosh, a lot of those areas used to be wetlands. And somehow that's getting missed. A lot of the areas that are hit really hard by drought and flooding are areas that no longer have wetlands to help kind of buffer them from those extremes. And so I think somehow the message isn't becoming very clear. And I think I can do a better job. We can all do a better job. But my perspective as a scientist is that we just haven't been able to communicate how important wetlands are to climate change, but how impacted they are as well.
To piggyback on that, a challenge, again, going back to the fact that the regulators are the ones that set the policy and the requirements that the mitigation banking industry follows. The regulatory agencies take a lot of pride in being very decentralized, especially the Army Corps of Engineers. There's 38 different districts of the Army Corps of Engineers, and each one of them is basically its own little fiefdom. They set out their own standard operating procedures, their own policies that the mitigation banking community in those particular districts respond to. And, so there's not a lot of consistency. In the state of Texas, the Fort Worth district has 3 different kinds of stream credits: perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral stream credits. And you need to basically offset impacts in an in-kind way. You go into the Galveston district and there's only one kind of stream credit that can offset impacts to any kind of ephemeral, intermittent, or perennial stream. And the difference between the Fort Worth district and the Galveston district is just an arbitrary political boundary that's drawn across the state of Texas. And then to layer on top of that, there's different state agencies. Some state agencies take a very hands-off approach to the mitigation banking program in that state. Some state agencies are very, very active, and in fact are so active that the Army Corps and the EPA might even defer to them and more or less rubber stamp the projects if they can get through the very rigorous state agency process. And so therefore, as a mitigation practitioner, you have to understand all of these different SOPs, all the different market dynamics, and all of the different natural ecosystem dynamics and hydrologies and everything else. And it makes for very complicated administration of the program. It should be complicated in the sense that a stream in Colorado and a stream in North Carolina are very different things, or a wetland in the Pacific Northwest and a wetland in Texas are very different things. So there should be some complexity, but there might be unnecessary complexity in terms of the administration of the program and the way it's decentralized that can make it very challenging. And I bring this up because this would flow through to the implementation of, any kind of policies or regimes that respond to climate change, where, one core district is probably going to respond very differently than a different core district, which is going to have dramatically different impacts on the mitigation banking industry and the incentive structures that they're responding to.
Thanks for that. That's a great added dimension. Okay, so climate change is impacting wetlands restoration projects and forcing compensatory mitigation practitioners to think in new ways. Are there any final thoughts any of you would like to share about thinking in new ways and evolving as climate change impacts your work?
I like what Megan said earlier, that wetlands can be a solution. I truly embrace that. Functioning wetlands and stream systems can be a solution as we face changes in climate. And I think the work that we are doing as mitigation providers is providing a head start to having and restoring and providing some of those functioning systems.
I can jump in. As a mitigation practitioner, we would love to see tools that we could implement that help us respond to a changing climate and across different geographies and regions so that we can site our projects in ways that most benefit the watershed and most benefit the ecological resources that we're trying to restore and preserve. And so, for example, the Nature Conservancy's tool, as mentioned earlier, would be incredibly helpful if it was implemented at a broader scale or required to be implemented at a broader scale in ways that are most relevant to the different regions of the country. But right now, we're not seeing any of those tools be prescribed or required. And so I think the mitigation banking community, for the most part, is not reacting in a way that utilizes them. And so therefore, we're not taking advantage of the body of knowledge that's out there that will help us site and design the best projects possible in the context of a changing climate.
Yeah, I mean, I think wetlands are literally overlooked. They sit in the low areas and they're often densely vegetated. So, as someone who looks at wetlands from above using satellite imagery and modeling what they're doing on the landscape, I have the benefit of seeing their value and how important they are. I think for most folks, for the average person, they're not realizing how important wetlands are to their communities. And they're really the unsung heroes. When I think about a storm event or a drought event, I'm thinking, gosh, wetlands are silently doing their job. They're filtering water. They're offering cool, life-filled spaces during drought. They're protecting us from big floods. So I think we need to make sure that we're understanding how important they are to us. I think as climate change continues, wetlands will become even more important. And I think some watersheds have already lost so many wetlands. And so losing more is going to make their communities less resilient. So restoring wetlands for some watersheds, absolutely critical. For other areas, they need to think about how they can build restoration so that they have long-term success. But I think that my final thoughts are just how important wetlands are and how we really need to consider how much we've already lost and how they can be brought back at a watershed or landscape scale to build back resilience into the future. Because as we face climate change and we have more and more extremes that we're already seeing, this is going to become an even a more important factor.
Thanks, Megan. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. And with that, I just want to thank you three for being on the podcast today and sharing your perspectives in the important work that you're doing to restore wetlands. Thanks for being on today, and I really appreciated this conversation.
Happy to join. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was fun.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.